about radical technoculture for racial equity. To give a little background on myself and how I kind of got into this field, I went to this program called Interactive Telecommunications at NYU, and that's where I got introduced to possibilities in emerging art and tech, and became very excited about all the cool things we can do with tech. And then while being in the program, I realized that tech is a very powerful tool that can be used to both empower and disempower people, and wanted to have more conversations around how it's doing that, and considering race and culture while doing that. And so I created an institution called Technoculture, which has been most realized in the form of an annual festival where we come together and think about how technology can be used to eradicate racial disparities, but also to think about ways that we can celebrate culture while considering technology at the same time. And then following Technoculture, I became a research fellow at ITP, where I explored more of the social implications of technology, and have returned as a research fellow now, considering the different social implications and also the artistic implications. But this will be focused on the more social, and it's a reflection of a few years of research in different areas, but it's research in so many different branches of knowledge that sometimes can be really difficult to kind of synthesize all together. So this is an effort to try and show the relationships between different branches of knowledge and kind of how so many parts of life have found their way in culminating to this, where we are today, and what we might consider for the future. So a lot of this research is based off of a conversation that I had with a friend with a presenter at Technoculture after the festival had died down, where we were talking about protests and activism, and something she said was we have to move from being reactionary to visionary. And a lot of activist work is very much being in the streets and protesting and combating the different racial oppressions, but sometimes it can be difficult to imagine, okay, well, what next? What are we fighting for? And what kind of future do we want? So it became very important for me to consider in what ways would this future look like, and in order to understand what this future might look like, it's very important to understand what has happened in the past. So within this talk, my main points of concern are: how has racial inequality been historically designed? In what ways is racial inequality cycling into today through technology? And in what ways can we imagine eradicating racial disparity? And so, as I mentioned earlier, this is a synthesis of a lot of different branches of knowledge from a few different centuries, and considering how race is operated in America. And this is being done through the lens of sociology, public policy, urban design, economy, and surveillance, and others. And in starting this sort of research, I started to map out how are these different branches of knowledge interacting with one another, and kind of creating a sort of oppression machine or landscape. And studying how these different communication systems and the history of the internet is kind of where a lot of it tied into and started to grow from. It was much of the foundation. And also considering colonialism and how so much of that is embedded in technology. And a recent article that I read, Chile Mbembe said, historically, the expansion of colonialism has to do with the broader question, who is it that the earth belongs to? European powers had decided that the earth in its entirety belonged to them. So this idea of colonialism and the way that it's replicating into technology will also go into. So I won't go into the history of the world, but I think it's important to realize and at least acknowledge kind of where America came from and how it was birthed into where it is today. So to very quickly just scan kind of what has happened in the past 4 or so centuries of this deep colonialism and extraction from the African continent, and then the mass exploitation of the people from that continent, and then the continuous disenfranchisement of the people in horrific and terrorizing ways. And finally, we're here in the Vietnam War, and considering, and these same kind of technologies, analog technologies are being deployed in places outside of the US. And also they're using their employment of these technologies outside the US to also bring back into the more urban areas of the States. And what I mean by that is, when we were in the Vietnam War, we were thinking about how can we successfully win this war. And we're not finding success in our traditional weaponry of using guns and bombs to kill people, but we more need to understand how people are operating. And what are they thinking, and what are the different things that they value. And so as they did this, they were able to use intelligence into Black inner cities, and we'll go into that in a second, but also just to give the social context around this, we're also seeing a lot of combat towards this war within the American society. The biggest and most famous boxer, Muhammad Ali, was one of the first biggest advocates of going against the war, and was actually, his title was taken away because he refused to be drafted. We have MLK, who was usually seen as a peaceful member, publicly criticizing the government in this war. And we also started to see a lot of turmoil within the universities of students being some of the primary anti-war activists. And then this emergence of Black Power, where it wasn't about Blackness as a sort of race that people inherit, but more of a political ideology of being against this racial social order. So the Army is very much the foundation of the internet, in that they were considering how can we win the war in Vietnam without traditional weaponry, but more of surveillance. And so they would study the people, and they would study what they're scared of and what they're incentivized by. They would kill their leaders. They would artificially induce experiences of famine, and they would see how this would destroy their inner selves and be able to control and manipulate them. And that intelligence is what they brought into inner city, or as people call it, inner city America. And also considering how a lot of this work that was being done was generally being done by homogenous groups of people. So their values were replicated, or are replicated through the technologies when we use them. But also around this time, and considering how we had the anti-war people, and also this sort of emerging group of people called hippies. And so the Whole Earth Catalog was considered kind of the Bible of the hippie movement. Stuart Brand, the creator of the Whole Earth Catalog, wanted to create a sort of almanac for people that were living in communes. And these were people that had left the society of America because they were so disgusted with the practices of the Vietnam War, and decided to create their own little communities. And so in them creating communities where they were completely removed by the rest of the world, or at least the country, Stuart Brand found a great opportunity to introduce this sort of autodidactic philosophy of creating an opportunity for people to learn about different things in one catalog that could be sent to people that were on their own. And so this new sort of philosophy started to develop, this hippie philosophy of turn on, tune in, and drop out. And turn on being to expand your individual consciousness, usually through drugs. So psychedelia was big in this era, to explore your social awareness and interact harmoniously with the world around you, be in tune with the life of others, and explore the pitfalls. Drop out being explore the pitfalls, the potentials of technology and nature, and a self-reliance, a discovery of one's singularity. And so while they were removing themselves from the world, they also saw technology as a powerful tool, a sort of technoculture tool. And so another important note is to consider how these hippies were also children of baby boomers. And so there was this much more, greater access to disposable income, and it was a different kind of lifestyle. So them removing themselves from the world was also a very privileged way of going about it. And also to consider how in the 1930s, so a few decades before this, people in other parts of the world were also thinking about how technology could be used in utopic purposes. And so around this time, we have the anti-imperialist movement in India, and Gandhi being a big part of that, of him being someone that heavily criticized the West and their kind of fetishization of technology and power, and kind of centralizing all technology into more urban areas, where the rural areas would be left with a lot less economic resources. And so, and through this, they started thinking about how can we use technology for the betterment of our society and to disseminate more economic resources. But these are people that we'll find later, have been people of bourgeois class, and that they have access to a lot of things. And so they're thinking from their stance, how can we better our circumstance, but not also thinking about the people in the most marginal areas. And so what we're finding is something very reflective of this quote: any revolution would not come from the working class realizing its alienation from its own labor, as classic Marxism theorizes, but rather, as Marcuse argues, from a new youth movement that resists its own inculcation to such a system in the first place, and joins together with the dispossessed and already operating outside of it. So to return to this Whole Earth Catalog, it was very much a philosophy of self-education. And so if it's a self-education that's replicating certain values, it's also missing a lot of other values. Well, eventually it became more inclusive, and it included a to a grant invited the Black Panthers Party to edit an entire edition. And so in this was allowed to create a sort of communication between hippies, which were very much, they want to remove themselves off the grid, with Black Panther parties and Black Power movements, which very much wanted to find out how they could survive on the grid. And we're also seeing this emergence of kind of the medium of the message, as Marshall McLuhan said. And this idea of how can we find ways to get our voices out there and not be so centralized, and considering how generally communication has been very centralized. So we have NBC or CNN and all these different communication platforms that are kind of preaching their perspective and not including people that are on the streets. And so we see this happen with printing. Emory Douglas of the Black Panthers Party, and them being able to quickly relay a lot of important information to people and gather and build community. But we also see this especially with the emergence and the creation of the first portable Sony camera, video camera, where initially it was something you can see in the upper right picture of CBS having this huge pack on their back that they would use to record different things that were going on, but eventually became something that was much more portable and allowed for other people to share their perspectives. And so we see this emergence of things like Guerrilla TV, where we have people on the streets that are recording protests or disruptions or just other ways that people are living. And the emergence of this sort of counterculture communications system with Radical Software, and also with this media art and architecture group called Ant Farm. And one of their big projects was to travel around the world and to create a sort of database on the perspectives of other people. But what we're also going to see is history suggests that once people are doing better, they're less likely to revolt against the system that they're making gains in. So while technology was seen as a sort of institutional, elite kind of place to create, it was also very much in conversation with the hippie movement and counterculture movements, and many of them were in these institutions and creating these technologies. And especially in kind of graphs like these, where we see things like Stanford Research Institution having these direct conversations with the whole Earth catalog. It was a big kind of system that included both technologists, but especially technologists with countercultural perspectives. And what we're seeing is also that these countercultural perspectives are kind of changing the way that they're approaching the techno-utopic kind of ideals of recognizing, Ant Farm recognizing how power is no longer measured in land or labor or capital, but by access to information and the means to disseminate it. And we also saw a huge shift with the Indian technoculture, them being initially for this anti-imperialist movement of being able to use technology to empower more voices. But while they were doing this and reaching Indian independence in 1947, students that were graduating from these elite Indian institutions didn't have a place to go to continue their activist efforts. So eventually it culminated into a huge Indian IT infrastructure. So how has racial inequality historically been designed? We've seen how the world has operated and how people have tried to be activists, but oftentimes it's kind of merged into this idea of global capitalism. It's important to kind of understand how policy has influenced the way that we're using technology today. So in 1944, we had this thing called the GI Bill. And the GI Bill was very much created in response to the Cold War of the Americas seeing that if we get more people interested in buying homes and investing in capitalism, it would be much easier to fight communism. But the GI Bill was also mostly privileging white veterans as opposed to black. And in considering how mortgages and housing has been one of the biggest sources of economic prosperity for Americans, to exclude an entire part of the population then results into this sort of racial disparity. And it's also not done just to exclude, but to place black people in certain areas. And so they were only allowed to live in more commercial areas where warehouses are, but also incredibly inconvenient to access basic needs like better schools or hospitals or central areas. And we also see this sort of war on drugs, where this practice of police hyper-surveilling black communities, and this then turned into data, which we'll see how it manifests later. But this war of drugs, not because black people were more often practicing drug use than white people, because we saw that statistics it's been observed that statistics show otherwise, that black people are not using drugs more than white people, but more of a tactic to surveil in order to disenfranchise and to brand black people with a certain identity, and to get in and to understand what they were doing. Because for Nixon at the time, his biggest threats were the anti-war and black people. And so it was seen from one person on his staff that the use of the war on drugs was to disrupt the communities, to arrest their leaders, similar to what we were seeing in the Vietnam War, vilify them, knowing that they didn't have drugs, but just to be able to surveil on a deeper level. So what matters is not the technology itself, but the social and economic system in which it's embedded. And it's very much garbage in, garbage out. So in what ways is racial inequality cycling into today through technology? Well, if we consider how technology was very much created by mostly white men, they're using their own faces for data sets, for computer vision. So when we have things like Google Photos, who is releasing these new technologies for people to use, and then it's also being used in very racist ways, such as one of my friends here, Jackie, who used it and saw how it was identifying him and his friend as gorillas, which is something that is incredibly offensive historically and politically in the way that black people have often been made to be animals or considered to be gorillas or animals. Or things like self-driving cars, which are the future and are going to be practiced more socially soon, of how a study from Georgia Tech saw that these self-driving cars also don't recognize darker skins as well. When they're driving, it's very hard for them to make out people of darker skin complexions, which could serve as a great danger for people that are walking on the street that are darker skin complexions. But also consider how these cars are deciding who lives and dies in moments when faced with a potential threat for a car crash. So who is it choosing to save and who is it choosing to kill? We have IBM using NYPD surveillance footage to develop technology that lets police search by skin color, which is a huge invasion of privacy, and also politically incorrect on so many different levels. And then we have this war on drugs that existed that we saw was racist in its practice and implementation, and that data is being used to build different systems and softwares like predictive policing. Predictive policing is coming into different municipalities because these different municipalities are having budget cuts, which then results in police cuts. So these police departments are trying to find ways to continue to exist with lower income sources or lower economic sources, and so they're investing in these different softwares to do sort of police practice. But these softwares are embedded with data that's dirty, as Rashida Richardson of AI Now says, this dirty data that's based on racist practices that says that more crime is likely to exist in the areas with higher population of black people. And so if police are using this software and they're assuming that if they go in a certain area because it's black, that they're more likely to find crime, that's already creating a sort of unfair precept. Or how technology is being used to decide who gets out of the jail system and who stays, and how something as how these two cases can have such different results of a black male that's 22 years old getting locked up for marijuana possession one time can be contained in jail, while a 25-year-old, what might be white passing male, gets locked up for gun possession and has been locked up twice and get released. And how these systems are being used and people don't understand what's going on inside of them. It's a sort of black box, but they're still being practiced on people's lives. Or redlining, where I showed you how black people were being pushed out into the more commercial, remote, harder to access areas. And then we see things like Amazon's same-day delivery service, and it was first rolled out, also excluded these same areas. And when they were approached by it, they mentioned that they didn't mean to, it was an accident, it was just because it was more expensive to get to those areas. If I had a sociologist or someone that was familiar with public policy and housing had been on the team, they would say that that's not an excuse and that it was designed that way. And so it was unfair to exclude these communities that had no choice to live in those areas, but to live in those areas. So ways that racist algorithms may continue into future technologies, for me, I have a few particular certain situations that I'm concerned about, like peer-to-peer economy-based companies, where things like Uber can exist and can change its policy and the way that it's going to pay people in split seconds, and the people that are working in this company just have to abide by it, and it's very hard for them to unionize against this company when they don't have direct access to the other people that are working within this company. So what is the future of unionizing in peer-to-peer economies? Or with internet and more of quote-unquote developing nations being provided internet infrastructures by big tech companies, what happens when we have a next world war, where it's assumed that it'll be a cyber warfare, where states, a country and a quote-unquote developing nation disagrees with a big tech company, and this big tech company can do things like control their water supply or internet with a switch. So power and the ability to live in disagreement with bigger powers. And so colonialism is also being replicated from what it was analog and now into digital forms through digital colonialism, especially in the global south. And Michael Quett released a really informative article on how this is kind of happening, where Silicon Valley is taking over the digital economy in the global south, such as in South Africa, where Google and Facebook dominates the online advertising industry and is a threat to local media, or Uber challenging the taxi industry and has resulted in materialized into wars and dangerous conflict between people, especially in South Africa and in Kenya. And Netflix not only pulling subscribers away from local television services, but they're buying that content on Africa. So the streaming giant is becoming the biggest internet media in the world. Big tech is also causing a crisis in the tech ecosystem in that they're replicating colonialism through forms like proprietary software. So people don't understand the software that they're using and how it's infiltrating their lives, which can allow for things like spyware and other forms of digital oppression. And poor communities are overwhelmed by the readily available services and technologies and can't develop their own industries and products to compete with these Western corporations. So they're left outside of this economic sphere of technology. Open source has seemed as a sort of radical tool that I personally have some debate about that, of who has access to build these sort of open source tools and how can they sustain themselves financially. But generally, in its ethos, open source can allow for more tech to be more transparent, so people can understand the ways that it's working. And in that colonization of emerging markets is happening through digital infrastructure, with big tech companies becoming more deeply invested in their technologies, being embedded in the lives of people more worldwide, and they're starting early, so they're embedding their technologies in things like classrooms, and getting the youth hooked onto their technologies in ways that it's operating earlier on. And while they're doing this, they're negating the cultural values of people in different communities. And so while they're reinforcing their Western values, it's silencing the perspectives of other people. And it's also becoming a new form of law, and that if most of the way that we're disseminating information and learning and communicating is through these big tech companies, their policy becomes the way that we're allowed to communicate with one another. So in what ways can we imagine eradicating racial inequity for the future? Well, with the war on drugs, there have been great work by people that have created BillBlock, a cryptocurrency scheme against Bill, so running computer power that eventually materializes into finances to help people get out of jail, or predictive policing and these sort of satirical, humorous approaches to flipping that scenario with things like the white-collar crime systems. So maybe not looking for black populations and assuming that they're criminal, but instead looking at predominantly white and wealthy areas and wondering what's going on in those areas. Or remembering the predominantly white men that have been developing the internet with different institutions that I'll plug in an initiative that I've developed called Technoculture, where we're gathering people of different racial backgrounds and considering how can we use our understanding of race and culture and activism to come together and shed light on the possibilities that we can use technology to advance our cultures. And within this institution and festival particularly, we have had people like Stephanie Dinkins, who shared work on her work on having conversations with AI and kind of the racial implications of AI, and how you might have a conversation with someone of a certain cultural background that's this AI system. or Mimi, who has done a lot of work on data sets and what sort of data is collected and what is not collected, and the politics behind that, of what's the reason that certain data isn't collected. Or Salome and Ayo, who created IAPO Repository, which is a resource library that houses a collection of digital and physical artifacts created to affirm and project the future of people of African descent. And so this one particularly is a sort of pendant that someone might wear, whether in certain areas that maybe has had some sort of big disruption with police and community or sort of disorder, it would highlight, it would illuminate. And also Victor Dibia, whose work I have heavily admired, considering how so much of the Black experience and Black culture has been rooted in the removal of an understanding of our history and our access to our own cultural artifacts pre-colonially. And so with Victor using AI to create maps that don't exist, but could exist through data, gives us a good starting point, considering how can we use technology to maybe gain access to the artifacts that we no longer have. And generally, I think a lot about things like the FDA, how it's been operating to make sure that the food and anything that we're consuming is safe. And I think something like this is needed for the technology industry, but making sure that the tech that we're allowing into our lives is also safe. And I've been working with the Aftertopia community and considering what does this look like. And so in having different think tanks where we're thinking about the anti-racism culture of the future, and making sure that we have a lot of different voices at the table that are considering what this might become or form into. And so for me, a few things that I think are necessary in this sort of manifesto is more support for efforts for marginal communities and their emancipation efforts. And we've seen the work of groups of people that have a lot of privilege, that have attempted to use technology in utopic sort of ideals, but it's very hard to get. I think more work needs to be done in empowering the people that are more marginal and less privileged places and see what they create. I think there should be a stronger questioning on this idea of globalization and universality, and that universality, it has to negate and silence different perspectives in order to operate. More anti-imperial efforts, decentralizing possibly of internet infrastructures, maybe we all don't need to connect into the same place. Destroying the sort of dichotomy between tech and humanity, and that more technologists should be more aware of public policy and sociology, and technology that generally affects the human population. So, thank you. I don't know how much time we have left.
About 10, 12 minutes.
Happy to take any questions. Technoculture?
Okay, yes.
Without an H. AFROTECTOPIA. Yeah.
Okay. What are your thoughts about the creation of more like, I feel like this is kind of corny to say, but like a Black Silicon Valley or like more POC companies, because I feel like a lot of issues come from the fact that we don't really have a lot of products that are needed by like the majority of the world, and so like a lot of kind of assaultive technologies or just policies to be inflicted on us without like there's no like I feel like we don't have many barriers or like any protection, and this could be an area where we can begin to develop these type of protective systems for ourselves just by having more Black tech companies.
Yeah, I think it's something I'm thinking a lot about, and I don't have a solid answer for it yet, but I am thinking a lot about equity and the idea of equity. And for me personally, I'm thinking maybe that's not something I'm actually striving for, because equity in this system means that we are operating in a capitalist system that only is successful with the exploitation of other people. So to realize the sort of equity, like Black equity, where we're perpetuating what has already existed of continuing to exploit maybe black people that just don't have the privilege that we have, I think is a very questionable thing. So the idea of black Silicon Valley worries me, and that it will just be all the things that are wrong with Silicon Valley with black faces on it, and not really an assessment of how we can challenge the values of Silicon Valley and create our own system. So I don't know what the result of it is, but I know that I don't know if I want a black Silicon Valley per se. But I do want more black people and people of other experiences creating technology that we're using.